How do economic downturns affect the amount of energy we use? And the source of that energy? Well, there hasn't been very much good news from COVID-19, has there? But new research does suggest that it might have led to a permanent increase in the use of renewable energy sources. Hello, Jonathan.
Hey, Tim. Good to be with you.
Jonathan, it's no surprise that energy use typically drops during a recession. Historically, how big is that drop off, and does it come back afterwards?
So what we do in this paper is we collect data on recessions for nearly half a century, and we cover close to every country in the world, something like 176 countries. And what we find is that and we look at different definitions of recession. I don't think there is a single definition. You could talk about years of negative growth. You could talk about peak to trough movements. You could talk also about highly relevant particular kinds of crises, like financial crises, like the GFC. And you could talk about the drops in output associated with this pandemic and other pandemics in the 21st century. So we look at all these events. It doesn't really matter what kind of measure you use. And what we find is that indeed energy demand drops off sharply during these events. And by sharply, low double digits, 10% is not unusual for your typical event of this kind. And it can be total energy demand you're talking about. It can be oil or coal. It could be all of the different measures. And the interesting thing is that, as foreshadowed in your question, this is not a temporary thing. This is a permanent drop in levels. It is true that the growth rate of energy demand and most of the different components recovers when the economy gets back on its feet, but the gap in the level relative to the pre-crisis trend is a permanent gap of 10% or so. So this is it's an important feature of the aftermath of recessions and other crises. And I want to mention one other thing, which is that energy intensity is also something we're very interested in, and whether that changes as a result of a recession or crisis. And we do find that it does. In other words, it seems that when the economy gets back on its feet after the recession, it uses less energy per unit of output than it did before. So we may talk about different aspects of this as we go forward, but it seems as if there is some efficiency gained in how the economy uses energy. Think of it as it could be creative destruction, which we might talk about. It could be Darwinism, survival of the more efficient entities, but it's something that we find a permanent improvement in energy intensity as well.
Also, you make this fascinating claim that there is a greener energy mix afterwards. Now, I can understand why that would be after an oil price shock, for example, but why might it happen after other crises?
That is a question, and one on which we didn't have a strong prior when we went into this project. And I would say, although we may talk about this later, our project is not about the impact of oil price increases, relevant though they are today, on the energy mix between green and dirtier sources. It's about the impact of the recession per se. And the reason a priori we're not sure what would happen is that there's a lot of things going on. So during the downturn, energy demand, as we just discussed, falls off sharply. And what happens is that the less efficient, dirtier plants are the ones that get closed down first, because they're more expensive to operate in a marginal cost sense. Renewables tend to be very, very cheap to operate in a marginal cost sense. So even with lower demand, they're the go-to sources of energy during a downturn. They don't lose their position on the grid, and it's the dirty coal and oil sources that do lose their position, and they close down. So we've established that during the downturn, the dirtier sources of energy really fall off sharply, and the greener sources are resilient. But but is this temporary, or is it more persistent? And what we find is that you know operators of these plants have to decide, as demand recovers, whether they're going to put more money into restarting the more expensive, dirtier plants, or whether they are going to expand the greener sources in the recovery. And we've talked about the differences in marginal cost of operating those things, but there are other things going on in a recession. I mean, if you're going to invest in more green renewable sources of energy, you need financing, and financing may be difficult to obtain during a downturn. So, there are many different effects going on, and so we let the data speak. And what we find is that indeed, in the aftermath, the composition of energy, the energy mix, does tilt sustainably on a sustained basis toward greener sources. So the energy share of green sources rises on average something like by 2 percentage points. And we can talk about heterogeneities later if that's relevant, but that is an economically and statistically significant effect. So I think it is relevant, and something that we were not clear a priori, but it seems to be in the data.
Well, there's lots to dig into here, isn't there? So let's start with the most recent crisis, COVID-19, a very sudden stop in a lot of economic activity. How big was the drop-off in energy demand in advanced economies?
Yeah, so think of what we've been going through for the past couple of years, and think of what was going on in 2020 when the pandemic was really roaring, and we were having lockdowns everywhere, either total lockdowns or partial lockdowns, and the industrial and commercial sectors of economies really took a huge hit, and so their demand for energy really fell off. So if you look at weeks or months when economies were in either full or partial lockdown, it's not unusual to see energy demand drop off by a quarter or a fifth relative to the pre-pandemic situation when the economies were functioning normally. And keep in mind also that the other thing that was going on at this time is many of us were working from home, and we had much bigger energy demand from the residential sector. So some of the numbers suggest that maybe residential demand for energy went up by something like 40%. So you have to look at the totality of all of those things. And one of the headline figures is that in 2020, for example, on aggregate for the year, energy demand was lower than in 2019, and that is just a very, very rare event. You won't win any particular prizes for guessing when the last time that happened. The last time was in 2009 during the GFC. So it does happen, but it's a rare event. And again, something we may talk about when we get into more detail here. But even during this lockdown, these lockdowns, for reasons that we've already discussed, renewables energy demand and supply remained resilient and actually expanded during this period for the reasons that we've talked about already.
Yes, tell me about that. How big has this shift been towards renewables in the recovery from COVID-19? Of course, it's very relevant at the moment.
Yeah, so I mean, we are still in the midst of the pandemic. The pandemic is not behind us. But I mean, the main number that I want to emphasize is this compositional shift, which represents the joint impact of what is going on with dirtier fuels and what is going on with renewables, and it's the shift in the energy mix by 2 percentage points. So I think that is an important a number to remember, and we can talk about where we're seeing this more and where we're seeing it less. Your earlier question was a bit about advanced countries, and I do think Our analysis suggests that that is where the effects are more pronounced, and that probably has many causes. One is that, you know, greener sources of energy have received much greater investments in the advanced economies than in the emerging and developing economies. So there was a critical mass of those investments already, to a much greater extent than in the emerging and developing economies. It's more difficult for those economies to get financing to get the resources to make the shift, and providing those economies with financing is obviously an important policy challenge. And the other thing I'm sure we may talk about is the stringency of environmental legislation in terms of providing the incentives to make that shift. So that tends to be stronger in advanced economies than in emerging and developing economies. And so that suggests that, when you look at it, across the world, you're going to see larger shifts in the advanced economies than in the non-advanced economies.
Yeah, let me follow that one up, because recessions are considered to be a very bad time to introduce incentives if they deliver additional costs to firms in the economy. But are you saying here that a crisis might be a good time to introduce the incentives that move us to this greener energy mix?
Yeah, I mean, you will know that crises, perhaps paradoxically, are times when politicians decide to implement very difficult reforms that have proved incredibly challenging in more quiet times. Backs are against the wall, and I'm not particularly talking about the climate issue, but there is certainly a lot of evidence that crises provide opportunities to enact difficult reforms. Now, the challenge, of course, from many of those episodes is that in recessions and crises, people, certain segments of the economy of the population are suffering much more than people at the top who can weather these crises and these recessions much better. And so there can be a political backlash against reforms that disproportionately impact those who are already suffering disproportionately. And so politicians obviously have to be very mindful in designing reforms to pay attention to those who may lose as a result of these reforms, whether it's removing energy subsidies or whatever, to make sure that their vulnerability doesn't rise further as a result of the reform. And there are ways of doing that, and I think the more successful and durable reforms are ones, whenever they are enacted, that are politically sustainable, because only politically sustainable reforms that maintain the support of the populations by and large, including those that may lose directly from the reforms, only politically sustainable reforms are ones that are going to survive. So with that preamble, yes, crises are often an opportunity to enact reforms, but your question was much more pointed. And you were asking whether the recession per se, which is a situation where there is this creative destruction, where there is this shift in the energy mix toward greener sources, that the recession itself seems to engender such a shift. Whether, as we build back from there, it is important to have the right incentives. And I think absolutely it is critical to have those incentives, because, as I mentioned earlier, there is a big difference in the amount of the shift toward greener sources in economies that have appropriate incentives provided by environmental legislation. It can be tax-based legislation in terms of carbon taxes and all the tax-based measures, or it can be regulations and non-market-based measures. And it doesn't much matter quantitatively what kind of stringent environmental regulations you do have, but we find that the improvement in the energy mix is roughly double if you compare countries with stringent legislation and rules versus those that have much laxer rules. So that 2 percentage point shift in the energy mix might be something closer to 4 percentage points in the aftermath of a recession, supported by the right incentives, as you put it. So there is that nice interaction coming out of this period that I think is important to really propel us forward further.
Finally, Jonathan, I'm in the UK here. The energy prices here have shot up over the last few months. They're now a major component of inflation. They're imposing costs in businesses. Next door in Europe, we're having the same problems. Could you predict, based on this, some more creative destruction in the energy market in the near future?
Yeah, so this circles back a little bit, Tim, to where you started this discussion. And I responded there that the paper itself is not looking at the impact of high energy prices, but it is a fair and important question. And so what I'm going to say is not in the paper, but it is based on some other work that we have done. And, you said at the beginning rightly that higher oil prices or higher dirty energy prices would unsurprisingly contribute to the same kind of greening of the energy mix that we argue the recession is. But we can ask whether there is kind of a favorable interaction, a kind of symbiosis between the recession itself and the creative destruction and the level of oil prices. And just as there is in what we just talked about, a favorable symbiosis between the stringency of environmental legislation and the recession. And the answer to that question, as we discussed, was yes. And the answer to your current question is also yes, that basically there is, you get a more bang for buck from the recession in terms of encouraging that greening of the energy mix, both from environmental legislation and from the higher level of oil and gas prices right now. So yes, my prediction would be more creative destruction in an environment of higher oil prices than in an environment of lower oil prices. And we do find some statistical evidence to support that claim.
I think the phrase is "don't let a good crisis go to waste," isn't it, Jonathan? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
The title of the paper is Creative Destruction During Crises, an Opportunity for a Cleaner Energy Mix. And the authors are Pragyan Deb, David Furchery, Jonathan Ostry and Noah Talk. It is discussion paper 16819. The link to download it is on the screen now. Well, thanks for watching and we'll see you soon.